Hi, everyone. Very honored to be here. My name is Theodore Lechterman. My friends call me Ted. You're all now my friends, so please call me Ted. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at IE University here in Madrid. Recently arrived just a few months ago from the Institute for Ethics and AI at the University of Oxford. And I'm also involved with an ethics consultancy called Compass Ethics, which is based in California and Germany. Which advises organizations on how to anticipate and mitigate a variety of ethical challenges. So my talk today is called Managing the Ethical Challenges of the Silent Revolution. And what I want to do is review some of the ethical challenges that we've been talking about with respect to AI and quantum. And then sort of drill down into the details about what the role of business is in addressing some of these challenges and how we can translate good intentions into effective management strategies. Here we go. So let's review some of the AI ethics challenges, many of which have already come up and some of which maybe need a little bit more emphasis. Bias is something that we've talked quite a bit about. There are many sources of bias when it comes to artificial intelligence, and these can be of great concern. So, of course, the data that we use to generate models may be inaccurate, it may be misrepresentative. The models themselves may encode the prejudices of their programmers. And of course, since we live in an unjust world, I think that's not a very controversial statement, models that we generate on the basis of data from our unjust world are likely to at least reproduce and possibly intensify injustices when they make inferences or decisions about what happens in the world around us and in the future. Privacy, we've discussed as well. Maximizing many of the benefits of AI require that we surrender aspects of our personal lives to algorithms. But of course, this can come at the cost of our liberties and other interests. And many AI-enabled tools pose various threats to our privacy. So facial recognition can enhance the surveillance power of states. Other AI-enabled tools can allow our employers to monitor us, to allow advertisers to track us, all which may pose important threats to our privacy. So the question with privacy is what aspects of our personal lives are worth preserving in the face of some of these benefits, and how can we do so effectively? Something we've also discussed is the challenge of explainability, particularly when we're talking about very large and powerful and advanced forms of AI that contain, in some cases, billions of parameters. It may be effectively impossible to determine why a particular decision was made and how to verify whether it's accurate or fair. And this raises the question of, under what conditions is there a right to an explanation from an AI system? And if there is such a thing as a right to an explanation, what does that entail for the way that we design and use autonomous systems? So I think, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a few other challenges: accountability, accessibility. We've talked about these things in various ways. We've talked about automation. I do want to mention value alignment, however. Particularly when we talk about artificial general intelligence, there are worries about the possibility of robot apocalypse, that AI will at some point develop a self-preservation instinct, which will then lead it to either subjugate or eliminate the human race. So the question is, how can we ensure that advanced forms of artificial intelligence are aligned with human values? And once we ask that question, then there's the further question of, well, what are human values? We disagree profoundly about what it is to be human and what we care about. So how are we going to make those decisions? How are we going to align AI with human values? And finally, there's this question of AI for good, or the value of beneficence. Many of the things I've been talking about just now are risks, but there's also an important ethical question here of, what are the greatest potential uses of AI? That's an ethical question as well, and it's an important one because, again, we disagree about what's good, There are obviously going to be some causes that are better than others, or that are worth more investment than others. And so I think these are very important questions that we need to be asking, as we have been over the past couple days. So quantum is a field where very little has been written in philosophical ethics so far. And it's been sort of a great education for me over the past couple of days to listen to some of the interesting developments going on here, and to really sort of think, for the first time, to be honest, about what some of the quantum ethics challenges may be. And I think it's clear, at least, that insofar as quantum gets combined with AI, there's a great potential to reproduce or amplify some of the familiar challenges that I've been talking about. So take, for example, explainability. If the models of AI that we're familiar with now have 1 billion parameters. Quantum allows us to exponentially increase the number of parameters in a model. It just adds layers of black boxes on top of black boxes. This is going to make the challenge of explaining the outcomes of artificial intelligence even more difficult. And it challenges this idea that we may have a right to an explanation in certain circumstances. But I also think there may be some novel, or at least more serious, challenges to quantum than we're typically familiar with when talking about AI ethics. And I want to group these into 3 categories. So I think there are risks of abuse, that people with bad intentions may harness the capabilities of quantum computing for nefarious ends. So you can imagine quantum being used to generate biological or chemical weapons. We've already talked about the risks to cryptography for cracking all of our passwords and all of our secure systems. So I think this has to be on the agenda when we're thinking about ethics of quantum. But suppose we're able to control malicious actors or secure our systems against these threats. I think there are still going to be risks of negligence, that people with benign or even good intentions may nevertheless end up causing harm in various ways. So we may modify our food sources or plants for various important purposes, for this only to result in some kind of environmental disaster. That's something I can imagine happening. In addition to sort of abusive and negligent uses of quantum, I think there are also controversial uses. Uses which are not necessarily good or bad, but things that people will certainly disagree about. So I'm talking about, in particular, modifications to the human genome to resolve various disabilities or to enhance our capabilities. These seem to become more and more possible with the advantages of quantum computing, and I think these are challenges that we need to grapple with as well. And finally, as with AI, there's also this question of, what are the most beneficial uses of quantum, and how should we think about those? I think Carlos's talk earlier today was a great example of some of the, interesting and important work being done in this area. But I think, it's not sufficient to just ask, can we use quantum for good, and are these good causes? But I think we need to approach that question systematically, to think about, really what are the best causes, and how should we distribute resources when looking at different potentially beneficial uses of quantum. So I said I was going to talk about, how do we apply some of these insights into the business world. Right? What is the role of business in this equation, and how can businesses effectively manage good intentions and handle some of these challenges? And I think there's a conventional view of ethics in industry, which goes something like this. Ethics is primarily about following the rules and doing some philanthropy on the side. It's about compliance plus philanthropy. There's also an emphasis maybe on value statements, about coming up with statements of corporate values to sort of unite ourselves around a set of common principles. It also includes the idea that ethics is primarily about good intentions and good judgment. but it's not necessarily an expert domain. No expertise is necessarily needed to practice ethics well, and ethics is not a high priority. It's got low ROI, and so this is something we can think about as an afterthought, as Charlie mentioned yesterday. And I think this view is, well, we can argue about whether or not this is a good view in general, but I think particularly when we're talking about AI and quantum, it's very difficult to sustain this kind of view. And so, I mean, in the first case, if we think that ethics is primarily about compliance, I think we need to recognize that laws are always going to be behind in some way when we're talking about emerging technologies like these, and they may be insufficient for managing these kinds of risks. Value statements may be very important for certain purposes, but value statements can't solve complex or acute problems, right? Of course, it's important that everybody in an organization has good character, good judgment, integrity, and so on. But when we're talking about very complex situations and scenarios, I think good intentions and good character are not going to be enough. And finally, I think since some of these risks represent potential existential threats, both to a business and to society, it's no longer tenable to think of ethics as a low priority. So what could ethics be for the silent revolution? How can we move from the conventional view to something that is, I think, more responsible and more effective? So I think we need to move away from the idea that ethics is primarily about compliance and philanthropy to the idea that ethics is about continuous reflection and justification of everything that we do. So it's about the products that we choose to make and not make. It's about the functions that we choose to assign to products and not to assign to products. It's about who we choose to sell to and not to sell to, what markets we choose to enter and what markets we choose not to enter. It's not only about following the rules and doing some good things on the side. I think we need to, of course, accept the important role of value statements and statements of principles, but I think we also need to move in the direction of concrete problem solving, to think about, more concretely, how can we resolve disagreements, resolve trade-offs, and come up with reliable protocols for dealing with these issues in a systematic way. I think it requires moving from the idea that ethics is something that anybody and everybody can practice so long as they have good judgment and good character, to the idea that ethics really requires a certain amount of expertise, and that's multidisciplinary expertise, especially expertise for philosophy, but also expertise from social scientists, from engineers, from legal experts, and others. And finally, I think it's important to recognize that we need to move from the idea that ethics is low priority and low ROI to the idea that ethics could be an incredibly important insurance policy as well as a market differentiator. I don't have any evidence to back up this idea, but I have a very strong intuition that companies that are able to lead on ethics, to demonstrate that they are trustworthy to their stakeholders, will have a tremendous advantage in the marketplace when dealing with tons of uncertainty and a lack of stakeholder trust when it comes to these kinds of frightening technologies. So just to sum up, I want to leave you with a few discussion questions that I'm hoping we'll continue reflecting on. I've presented you with a handful of ethical questions and ethical challenges, some of which we've discussed at length, and others which may be a little bit newer. But I'm wondering, for all of us, when we think about AI ethics, ethics of quantum, and joining the two together, are there any things that we're overlooking? What is not on the table that should be on the table? Or have we been misunderstanding some of these questions in the way that we've been thinking and talking about them so far? Second, what's the role of business in addressing these ethical questions? Obviously, there's a very important role for governments, but I think we can't rely on governments for everything, in part because governments will always be behind on these questions. And so business has to play a role. What should that role be? And finally, once we've agreed on what the role of our business is, what are some of the best practices for managing ethical challenges in AI and quantum? I've presented a rough theory and an example of how that theory could be applied, but there's plenty of room for further development and discussion. So thanks so much, very much looking forward to the panel.